All right, I'm gonna get everybody in here. So yes, you can, let them ask questions whenever, and we're gonna go from there. All right. All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our February Warren County Safety Council monthly meeting. We appreciate you joining us. And we have a great speaker, lots of updates, and we appreciate you being here. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Will. You can give us our updates.
All right, thanks, Angie. And hope everybody can see the screen. But welcome to our February 2022 Warren County Safety Council meeting. As always, I'm still Will Satterfield, your local safety specialist from the Bureau's Division of Safety and Hygiene, here to help and answer any questions you might have. As far as upcoming webinars we're having, everything on the screen with the exception of the bottom right-hand one, the Osha on-site consultation, Ohio's best kept secret. That's the only one that isn't in the past. It's happening on February 22nd, 11 to 12. So one more webinar for the month. Of course, a lot of these are available on the website. You can just replay them at your leisure. As far as upcoming virtual classes, I believe the first few here have already passed, with the exception of the last one on the screen right now, Safety for the Non-Safety Professional. It's basically a full day class that we broke down into 2 half days on February 22nd and 23rd. And then the remainder of the schedule for the month and early March. On the 24th, we have Crisis De-Escalation Tactics and Safe Practices Workshop. 28th, we have Hazardous Waste Operations Series 4, Air Monitoring and Work Zones. And then another full day class broken into 2 sections, Controlling Workers' Compensation Costs on March 1st and 2nd, 9:30 to 12:30. And on the 3rd, we have hazard material and waste shipping reporting requirements. So lots of opportunities for education available here. We do have a new flyer on our safety services with some ideas as to how you can, personalize our services to fit exactly what you need in your workplace. And a reminder, I think you've heard me mention this every month, every meeting for a few months, but the Ohio Safety Congress and Exposition's coming up on March 9th and 10th. And again, we will be virtual this year, but hey, it's an opportunity to attend. We have 1-hour sessions throughout both days on a variety of safety, health, workers' compensation topics. There's some half days, some full day seminars. This year, we're actually offering some on-demand seminars that are available for quite a period of time. So be sure to register and check it out. And you can register on our website. And we're really have a lot to offer this year since we've had some practice doing this virtually, but this is kind of what you'll see on the website, and you can look around, check out all the sessions, keep track of your continuing education units and so forth, visit all the virtual vendors that'll be there. So I encourage everybody to register and attend and get involved with Safety Congress. Now, as far as news from OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, please remember that on March 2nd, employers that need to keep records, the 300 log. You have to submit your OSHA logs electronically if you had more than 250 or more employees at any point in time during the prior calendar year, or certain establishments with 20 to 249 employees at any point in time during the prior calendar year will need to submit their 300A, the summary, electronically. Lots of information on OSHA's website about how to do that if you've never done it before. And remember that number 2 there, the 20 to 249 employees, is certain industries. So, to be sure, you might want to take a look at the website. Now, little question and answer. Feel free to use the chat. But the OSHA question of the month, do you see anything wrong with the picture? And what could be improved if you do? Feel free to type in the chat. Which for some reason I cannot see if there is anything. Well, by law, OSHA's regulations, whenever you're using a ladder to access a roof, the side rails have to extend at least 3 feet above the landing or the roof or whatever you're going to be stepping off on. So you have to be sure that's the case. You can see some pictures of some other ways to secure the ladder. Picture in the middle, bottom middle, has outriggers, kind of stabilizing braces on it. So there are several ways to do that. And looking at the original picture, I'm not so sure that that ladder set up at the correct angle. Should be 4 to 1, 1 foot away from the wall for every 4 feet in height you're going up. So remember too, March is Ladder Safety Month, so I'm sure we'll all see more about that. And now we're going to hear from Kathleen Davenport, our Southwest Regional Business Consultant. We're one of them down here in the Cincinnati area. So Kathleen.
Good morning. Thanks, Will. As Will said, I'm Kathleen Davenport. I'm Tim McDermott's counterpart. I think you've met Tim at some of the previous meetings. He's the one that actually covers Warren County, but I cover a lot of the surrounding counties as well. But I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about a new program, the Substance Use Recovery and Workplace Safety Program. And this program is something that's been in place on a pilot basis for about 2 years, and now effective this year, we rolled it out statewide and including Warren County. But the program reimburses for expenses for having a drug-free workplace program, and it's a reimbursable program. You do not have to be in our drug-free workplace program to participate. You can be in group rating, group retro, any of our programs, as long as you're not self-insured or a state agency. You can take advantage of this opportunity. You can see on the slide the different aspects that it reimburses for. What is relatively new is that we will reimburse for the actual cost of drug testing if you have a second chance or do not terminate based on a first positives. Some employers have multiple chances. Some employers will call this a last chance agreement or rehabilitation agreement or return to work agreement. But if you do not terminate based on the first positive, you can apply for reimbursement up to $1,500 a year for the cost of your drug testing. And that could be your pre-employment, new hire, reasonable suspicion, follow-up to treatment, any of that for any of your employees. We also will help reimburse for policy development and legal review. Policy development, developing a well-written policy is critical for any employer, especially with laws changing in regards to medical marijuana and other things. This is a good time to, look at your policy, to develop a strong policy. And we also pay for legal review if you have an outside counsel review your policy, and we strongly suggest that without everything changing. It also pays for employee education and supervisor training. Supervisors need a little extra training in looking to document reasonable suspicion, how to approach somebody that they suspect is under the influence, how to refer employees to needed resources if there is somebody on your work site that is under the influence, but also employee education for people that, letting your employees know the effects of drugs and alcohol in the workplace. Next slide, please. The nice thing about this program is we can actually go back to 7/1 of 2019 to request reimbursement. So right now you have until June 30th to go back and ask for any retroactive reimbursements going all the way back to 7/1 of 2019. And starting July 1st of this year, you'll have 1 year from the date of service to submit those requests for reimbursement. To be eligible, you can be any employer in the state, like I mentioned, as long as you're not self-insured or a state agency. Yeah, next slide, please. Yep, and that's your current on your premiums. I had a guy email me yesterday. He was delinquent in his true up, and he's getting ready to pay it. Once it's paid, he'll be eligible for tomorrow. So you don't have, as long as your current status is that you're current on your BWC premium, on your true up, your most recent true ups, you would be eligible. The last slide there is a map based on your county, the employer's county, that Warren County will request reimbursement directly from BWC. There are some counties that request reimbursement through their local ADMH boards. So some of the counties to the north and Hamilton County to the south of you guys are ADMH reimbursement counties. Some of you might actually reside in those counties. So I thought it was important to at least share the map. I will share my contact information in the chat. And if you have any questions regarding the program, please feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to walk you through the program and get you enrolled. Like I mentioned, we can ask for retroactive reimbursements back to 7/1 of 19. And it doesn't matter what BWC program you're in with BWC, as long as you're in the state insurance fund. And I think I'll turn it back to Angie.
All right, can you guys hear me now? Sorry about that, I was muted. Thank you, Kathleen and Will, for the updates. We appreciate all of that. We also have all the information that they send us on our website, so be sure to check that out as well. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker and turn it over to him. Jeffrey Mullins from Taft Law, he's a partner there, is our guest speaker today, and we'll be talking about epic safety fails and giving some information on that and how we can handle that situation. He is a partner there. He specializes in employment law. So Jeffrey, we appreciate you being here today with us, and I am going to go ahead and turn it over to you and get this screen shared here on my end, and we're good to go. Real quick, can everyone see this presentation slide? Can you see it? Perfect. All right, we'll go ahead and turn it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, could you go ahead and go to the first slide, the next slide?
Okay. There you go.
Well, first off, thanks for having me this morning. I appreciate it. And always good to speak to one of the local safety councils. I'm going to talk about epic safety fails today. And what I tried to identify there, I came up with 4 situations that have occurred over the last several years. And probably of all the things that I do, this is one of the times when I think clients need you the most. But at times it's like gut wrenching and just sort of being involved. You see things you not like to see. And sometimes you see situations with clients when things are at their worst. And that's always difficult to deal with. But I think it does help to share these situations. And frankly, all of these are situations where something very simple, while what happened was terrible in terms of the result, they're also really all things that some very simple steps could have prevented. And that's why I would call them a safety fail. Interestingly, just listening to Kathleen and Will, we had not talked about this in advance, but some of the things that they're proposing are things that I'm going to discuss and things that I think would have helped. So I'm going to start off with the epic safety fail number one was a failure to keep or read the operator's manual. And Angie, I think we may have your, somehow we switched to maybe your email and not the slide presentation. Thank you. So on the, just not reading the operator's manual, and a case we had on this, young man working in a factory using an upcut saw. And if you could picture this, it's almost like a saw on a table, and the blade comes up from the bottom. And when you want to cut a piece of wood, you're putting it on the table. There's rollers to the right and rollers to the left, so you can move large or long pieces of wood through it and make cuts. But you have that table, and then down by your foot, there's like a little area carved out in the table where you can put your foot inside this box, and there's a pedal in there. And when you press that pedal down, the blade comes up. And there's actually a guard that comes down from the top that would sit on the top of the piece of wood and hold the piece of wood in place. Then the blade comes up and into the guard. And all that, when I first saw it, everything looked like it should. What had just happened, though, was earlier that morning, a young man was operating that saw, and he had cut off his left hand. OSHA had been in touch already. I think they had heard about this from the paramedics. The first question that I asked the employer, knowing it was going to be the first question BWC and OSHA were going to ask them, was, do you have a copy of the operator's manual for this piece of equipment? People talking about it, looking at it, where frankly, they'd operated this piece of equipment for 30 years and had no injuries on it. Unfortunately, what happened to this young man was he was pushing a board, a 2x4, through it to cut. And it was like the second cut that he was making. And when he was pushing the 2x4 through, it went between the rollers on the other side and started to fall down. And he instinctively reached to grab the board. And when he did, his hand went under where the blade would come up and where the guard would come down. And again, in just sort of a compounding series of tragedies, his foot was actually in where the pedal is, and he put his weight on his foot, and the blade came up and cut his hand. That seems like a really strange series of circumstances that had to occur for this to happen. But when you think about things like operating a saw like that, there are things that typically a manufacturer has tried to anticipate. Because there are things called product liability laws, and because they also know that they don't want the people they're selling the product to have their employees get injured, so they usually try to build in some fail safes. And so I was scratching my head as to how this could have happened, and they went and found the operator's manual. And as I was looking through the operator's manual, I noticed that there was a safety device, a sensor, sort of on the back of the table. And it was operated through compressed air, and there was a tube that would run up to a sensor. And when the cut was supposed to be made and you were pressing the pedal, if that compressed air would blow into a space, and if it didn't hit resistance like a board there, the blade wouldn't come up. And so I'm looking at it, trying to see on the actual piece of equipment, how did this happen? Why didn't the fail-safe work? The sensor wasn't connected. The line wasn't connected to the sensor. And as I talked to the maintenance engineer that worked there at the plant, people that had been there, this was a piece of equipment that was put in service, bought brand new in 1990. But when I talked to the maintenance person who had actually been there that long, he'd been there since the 90s. He said, I don't ever recall that being hooked up. And so, what we were left with is probably nobody ever really looked at the manual and said, is this set up correctly? All the years when maintenance has been performed on that piece of equipment, nobody asked the question, what does this go to and why isn't it hooked up? I'll admit, I'm a guy. So, when my daughter a couple of weeks ago got an entertainment center from IKEA, I go over there, and when we're putting it together, the first thing I do is put the instructions off to the side and start looking at the parts and how many screws are there and how many bolts and how many holes. And I just want to work through it on my own, like an interesting puzzle, as opposed to actually reading the instructions. But when it comes to things like these types of pieces of equipment, things that you use in construction, manufacturing, or even in other settings, if you're using a dangerous piece of equipment, it always makes a lot of sense to look at that operator's manual first, to make sure everything is set up correctly, but also to see what should you be checking when you do maintenance on that piece of equipment. And in this particular instance, I think that one step, could have, probably should have prevented this. Now, actually, the manufacturer in later models of this did all sorts of different things to try to prevent this injury as well, because I'm not sure that was as effective a fail-safe as it should have been. This particular company, what they ended up doing was, you could install other types of controls on it. So they installed a control where you could only engage the saw rather than through the pedal. You could only engage the saw if you push the pedal down, and there were two buttons that you had to hold and push, one in each hand. And so with that in mind, your hand would never be in the place where it's not supposed to be. That was an example to me, just where taking that first step of actually looking at the manual, figuring out how things are supposed to be operated, how it's supposed to be installed, and what kind of things are supposed to be checked when you do maintenance on it, not just maintenance when something breaks, because that was the other question I asked the maintenance person. Do we have like a form that we use when we're checking this piece of equipment? And he said, this thing, all we ever do is change the blade on it. We've never had a problem with it in 30 years. They don't make them like that anymore, but so that they really, there is, I think, every piece of equipment like that you're using, it's really important to make sure that when we're using it, we understand how it's operated, how to do it safely. And if we're supposed to be checking something, whether it's quarterly, weekly, daily, what are those things that we need to look at to make sure that we're operating this safely? And I've had that situation kind of come up, particularly the maintenance situation, and some other cases. Everything from somebody, backing up a truck that didn't have, the sound alarm that's supposed to go off as the truck backs up, that not working. So there's an employee who's got his back to the truck who gets crushed when the truck backs over them. But frankly, if somebody had checked to make sure all those things were working once a week or once every couple of weeks, that never would have happened. Another one where in like a heat treating plant, where a big piece of equipment, like a 2-story piece of equipment, it looked like, you can imagine, almost like a cylinder in a car. It was something they used to a pound metal cylinder head popped off of that. And this was a cylinder head that weighed like 600 pounds, and it landed on an employee. And how did that happen? Well, it happened because they weren't checking the pressures and doing the maintenance they were supposed to be doing on a regular basis. And so, what I'm left with is one of the simplest things you can do is read the instructions particularly on these types of pieces of equipment, and then follow what the manufacturer says to do. If we could go on to the next slide. The next slide is failure to train employees. Another terrible case that I had involved a trenching accident, and boy, that it seems to be on the rise. We probably had 4 of these in the last 2 years, all involving fatalities, unfortunately. And this was one where 2 people are in a trench. They're needing to make somebody has already installed a pipe. There's something wrong with a pipe. They need to get back down there and check something on it. They want to do it quickly and expeditiously, so they uncover the pipe. 2 people get down in there to look at it. One is a very young and inexperienced employee, and one is a more senior employee that's been there for a number of years. Unfortunately, while they're down there, both the walls on both sides collapse and move in on them. The older employee is completely buried, and the younger employee is buried up to about his waist. And the older employee was killed in this accident. The younger employee lived, but still had significant injuries. And this was the first, years ago, this was the first trenching case I had, and just sort of learning about, how much dirt, a square foot of dirt weighs. Learning about, even when people are only partially buried, the damage something like this can do to their body, not to mention them psychologically being in that situation. But in this situation, when I arrived out there, what do you think I saw sitting next to the trench? A trench box. So there was a trench box out there. They'd used it when they put the pipe in and did everything else. Again, the thought here was, this is just something we have to check. Let's uncover it. We're going to just be in and out really quickly. So let's just do that and get this done. And there was a more senior employee there, and also a younger employee. And the younger employee had really had no training yet. It was so new. The company did their trenching training like once a year, but this employee had not had it. The more senior employee who was there and who had had training, what we kind of saw was that it just hadn't sunk in. And unfortunately, there really wasn't a competent person on site to say the way that this particular trench had been dug out wasn't proper to get in unless you were using a trench box. The edges of it, the sides of it weren't laid out the way they should have been to prevent this. When we went back and looked at this, the employer had a couple of things to fix. One of them was pretty much at orientation, not we're not going to do this once a year and try to pick everybody up, but at orientation, we're going to make sure that every single employee that comes through this operation, because we have to do trenching on a fairly regular basis and people have to get in trenches, we're going to recognize that, and we're going to make this part of our employee orientation. We're going to make this part of our toolbox talks that we do multiple times a year, and we're going to do a big training on it, for everybody. And hold 2 sessions to make sure everybody can be there, because this one is so important and it can be so dangerous. And then the other question really was, with the more senior employee, what's happening with people are going through this training and then still doing this thing? How does that happen? And I think there's a couple of answers to that. One is you need to tighten up your safety inspections. You need to make sure that you have a competent person on site who is assessing things. You need for employees to understand that, before you get down in that trench, if a trench is dug, somebody has to check it out and approve it before you get down there, who is a competent person, not just somebody who had the training once a couple of years ago. And if there's any kind of a history, or if we have somebody going around doing inspections and they see people in a trench like that, even when somebody's not hurt, but if they see someone in a trench like that, we're going to treat that like a near miss, like a really bad thing that could have happened, but thank God it didn't. We're going to treat it like that, but we're going to deal with and address the problem with those employees. And it's going to involve discipline, and it's going to involve retraining. And we're going to send a clear message out to the entire workforce when something like that happens, that it's unacceptable and that it can't happen again. So again, a simple thing, and many of you may already have this in place, and I hope you do, but looking at the biggest safety issues you have, and then trying to do some kind of orientation before employees ever even enter the workplace. And then also looking at our existing employees and not just saying, are we checking the box and doing the training, but do they get it? Are they following and the training that we've laid out? And are we checking up to make sure that's happening? And if it's not happening, what are we doing about it? Are we giving somebody a slap on the wrist, or do we really take this seriously? And it doesn't mean firing everybody. Today, that's really difficult to do because it's so hard to get and keep employees. But that does mean retraining. It does mean there may be some form of discipline that goes along with that. So I think in terms of training, that again, it's easy to put in place. It's important. And most employers do this to some degree, but I would tell you that I think not everybody does it as well as they should, and not everybody tests to make sure that what we're doing is effective. Next slide, please. Thanks, Angie. Failure to assess what I call unique work site conditions. One of the things, there's kind of a cookie cutter safety policy that says, well, I got a safety manual and I train people on safety. And so everything should be, that's all I really need to do. I'm done. I expect the people that go out to the site to recognize things. I expect everybody to perform their job safely. And sometimes that can be enough, but unfortunately, a lot of times it's not. And sometimes, let's be honest, there are unique aspects, unique conditions that exist on a work site. And we have to not only have a safety policy, a safety manual, safety training, we have to take those two things and look at an individual work site and say, how does this apply here? How can I make this more safe? We started off with that picture of the ladder. And I think actually working people through some exercises like that can be extremely valuable, because you're not just telling them what's safe, you're asking them to look at a situation and say, what's wrong here? What would you change to make this more safe? And so that is a piece that's missing. A couple of situations where this has come up for me in the last few years. I had one where people were building a hotel, and part of that hotel was an elevator. It was a 5-story hotel. And in the elevator, where they were going to be doing electrical work and other things, at one point, somebody had built a platform for people to stand on, and it covered the whole space of where the elevator would be. And underneath that, there were essentially joists that went across and were then mounted into the concrete shaft. And then on top of those joists, there was plywood, and the plywood was screwed into the joist. So essentially you had a floor in this elevator that was very safe for people to work on. When it came time to put in the cables and the things that would pull the elevator up and down, they needed to open up one side of the elevator. And so they instructed somebody to go in, and they said, look, the way we built those joists and everything else, you're not going to be able to get access to what you need to get access to on the side. So you need to open that up. So a subcontractor went in there to work on that. removed the joist, and removed the plywood. And they installed some of the wiring and other things they needed to install. But then nobody ever came back and put the joist back in. But somebody did come back and put a piece of plywood over the area, which was about a 2-foot by 6-foot area on the very edge of the elevator. Well, unfortunately, one of the people that was working in that area, they hadn't been on the project for a week when all this was going on. They came back, of course, thinking the elevator was just like it had always been. And there were 2 people in the elevator, and they were talking about the project and looking at the specs on something in the inside the elevator. And the one guy walked to the edge of the elevator, and that piece of plywood, just like a trap door. It was partially on one piece of a joist, and the rest of it was just open and supported by nothing. And he went down the whole 5 flights and was killed. And this is something where you probably had 4 contractors on the site, at least. And one of the contractors was doing something, hadn't informed all the contractors of it. People weren't there every day. People were coming in and going out. When you look at that, there were just multiple failures in this. But the biggest failure was the lack of communication. Really to say, we're removing this, we're taking this out. And everybody needs to know that, what was a safe surface is not a safe surface anymore, or at least for a while. And then the other thing was the contractor that came back and put the 2x4 on there. That was probably the worst piece of this, because why on earth, you would cover that back up with a piece of 2x4. And it sounded like what somebody said was, we're worried that people are going to throw trash down the elevator shaft, so we're going to put a piece of plywood there to cover that edge up. Well, once you cover that edge up and you don't leave any kind of notification or anything like that to say, this is unsafe, or you don't put up a rail in front of that so people can't walk over that far in the elevator, you've created obviously a very hazardous and lethal condition. And so, in this instance, what would have prevented that? I think one is just somebody assessing that condition in the elevator and keeping everybody apprised as to what it was. I think whoever put that piece of plywood down, again, should have assessed the conditions, the unique worksite conditions, and said, look, somebody's going to be working in this elevator. This floor before was completely supported, and I can't just cover this up with a 2x4. I've either got to support it again and then put the 2x4 on top, or I have to put a handrail or something up at the edge of this and then put the 2x4 on so that nobody can walk over there. But that's a situation where, I think people just didn't, a whole series of errors, but nobody recognized that issue, including in the last situation. I sort of understand why the person that went in there to work wasn't looking under the elevator. And they weren't looking under the elevator because the last time they were there, it was completely supported and they knew it was, and that's how it was designed and drawn and engineered to be done. But again, there were some things there where the 2x4 or the plywood that was sitting on it, it was raised up a bit. It was a little warped, and you could kind of, if you really did look at it and you had good lighting in the elevator, you might have said, that doesn't look like it used to look, what's going on? And ask some questions. And unfortunately, there was not good lighting in the elevator. Nobody noticed that the plywood looked different, had been cut, and it was a completely different color than the rest of the plywood. But some sort of a good assessment of those conditions unique to the work site could have prevented that. I had a similar situation a couple of years ago in Northern Kentucky at a manufacturing plant, and they were installing a big piece of equipment, and it was like a 3-story tall piece of equipment, and next to the equipment there was a big platform where people would be working on. They had people going into, our client had people that were going into work on that platform. The platform, when they installed the platform itself, they only had like 2 or 3 welds that were done on it, which might have been fine for a temporary basis if no one was going to be walking on it, and then you come back and finish it later. Unfortunately, our client had 2 construction workers working on that plate, and the plate pivoted and both of them ended up falling to their death. And again, it was a situation where it would have been great if somebody might have let the other contractors know, we're not done with this yet. Nobody's allowed to be on the platform. If somebody had assessed that work site condition, and people have been communicating with each other, but they weren't. And again, it would have been great if somebody on our company would have, once we knew people were going into an area where they hadn't been before, we had a competent person go out, look at the situation, size it up, and say, yes, it's safe to go in there, or no, it's not, instead of just these 2 workers going out there. But I think a big mistake that people make is that we've got policies, we've got training, but how do those apply to this job site, or this plant, this operation? And I think that can lead to some epic safety fails. Okay, and then the next slide. This one actually kind of ties into the other 2 that I discussed. When you think about this, with the elevator and with the and also with the construction site, and where the people were working on the platform. Anytime you've got more than 1 employer on a site, there's a whole Osha doctrine that deals with this, but anytime you've got more than 1 employer on a site, and so often now we do, because we've got employees of a contractor working in our plant. We've got a construction site where we may have a general contractor and 7 or 8 subs working at the same time. But when that happens and there's no clear line of authority as to who's responsible for safety, it's like that old saying that, if a person is if you're on a beach and there's somebody out in the ocean drowning and there's 1 person on the beach, that 1 person on the beach knows I'm the only person that can do this. So they're going to go out and try to save that individual. If there's 5 people on the beach, everybody thinks somebody else will do it. And while they're looking around and trying to figure out if somebody's going to do it, whether or not they're going to do it, should they do it, the person drowns. And that is oftentimes what can happen in multi-employer situations, where everybody thinks safety is somebody else's responsibility, and they're not checking to make sure that the thing that was supposed to get done definitely did get done. The way this is typically remedied is, there should be something, if you're the general contractor on the site, or if you're the company and you have people coming into your place of business, we need to work that out, either contractually or procedurally, or better yet, both, as to how we're going to handle that. And so if there needs to be something needs to be locked out, we're going to identify that in advance. And we're going to say that's our responsibility, or that's your responsibility. If there are holes, that somebody makes while they're installing electrical panels or something like that, or running wire, if somebody's going to make some holes and they have to make those, somebody's going to be responsible for going back and fixing the holes and or covering them up. Again, in my elevator example, if somebody's going to take out part of that platform and remove something that made it a safe surface to work on, somebody's going to be responsible for making sure that it all gets put back together the way it should have been. And back to the example with the other platform and the 2 workers in Northern Kentucky, when the person was only putting a couple of welds on that and wasn't making it a safe surface to work on, somehow that should have been taped off. People should have been notified, or it should have simply finished the rest of the welds and gotten it to the point that it needed to get to be safe to work on. But it's important that we have some sort of clear line of authority as to who's responsible for safety. And that's both a contract, maybe which people read or don't read, but also just operating procedures to say, if we're going to be on this site, here's operationally how we're going to manage safety. Okay, last slide. And this goes back to the drug testing that we heard Kathleen talk about. We had a situation 2 years ago where a roofing company, one of the roofers was on the roof and was under the influence and fell, slid down the roof, actually hit a second worker. Both of them fell off the roof. And as things sometimes happen in these cases, the worker that was under the influence walked away. And the worker that he hit was the worker that died. And I don't know what it's just how somebody fell, how somebody landed. It could have been that his body was so relaxed. But whatever it was, it just the irony of that situation doesn't escape you. But when we looked into it, the thing that came up was the company really didn't have a drug testing program in place that they used effectively. There were actually comments. Somebody had complained about this worker before and was saying, look, I don't think he's with it today. Somebody ought to do something about this. And at the time, the concern was more for him than for others, but it was just that we think he's doing something. And the answer was they thought he was smoking pot before work. It turned out he was, he'd been smoking pot the night before and then was smoking meth the morning of. But that particular employee, there was some word out there, something that people were aware of, and that they'd made others aware of, supervisory people aware of, and nobody acted on it. And again, right now, people don't want to lose anybody. I feel like at times, sort of thoughts about drugs, particularly marijuana, because of the medical marijuana statute, there's more people are becoming more accepting of this. But from a safety perspective, I feel like you can be however you want on recreational drugs or other things like that. From a safety perspective, when it ties into work, and especially when you work in a very dangerous environment, this is not somebody necessarily who's behind a keyboard all day, typing in data. This is somebody working on a roof, several stories up with other people and with dangerous equipment. That's a situation where I really feel like we can't afford not to ask these questions. We can't afford not to send people out for tests when we have cause for suspicion. And there's a whole series of things that go into that Kathleen mentioned. One of them is, how do you recognize, signs that someone is using? What is reasonable suspicion? Are people trained to see what happened? Do we document that correctly? Do we send the person out for the test? What do we do after that? Again, does it mean we have to fire everybody that tests positive? You could, but it also could mean that somebody who tests positive, you suspend them. It could be that you put them on a last chance agreement and you require them to get some sort of treatment before they come back to work. And if they don't get the treatment, then they're fired. If they do get the treatment, though, you could bring them back and say, we're going to randomly test you maybe, 6 times a year. And if you ever test positive again, we're going to terminate you. But what you'll pick up in that is if there's somebody who really is probably not an addict, but is using it recreationally, you may be able to stop that. If they value their job and want their job. But a last chance agreement, I think, is a great tool to use in doing that, because it really says to that individual, we're serious about this and you can either do this or not. But if you don't do it, there are going to be consequences. And I will just tell you time and time again, we find that when we look into an accident or injury, either alcohol or drugs play some role in it. And sometimes it's a huge surprise. Sometimes people say, I didn't see it coming. Other times, like this one, people did see it coming. And we didn't have a strong procedure in place to address it when it did. And so I think, going forward, what this employer did was really they set up a strong drug testing program. And they tested people before they hired them and tried to make an effort to make sure they weren't bringing people in who were already users. After employment, they came up with a a program much based on the Ohio Drug-Free Workplace program. They came up with a program like that. And they also started using last chance agreement with their employees. So I do think that's, again, an area where, you know, if you have a lot of people that you're not watching and who are operating in a dangerous environment and who may be using drugs either recreationally or on a regular basis, particularly before work and coming to work under the influence, that is literally an accident waiting to happen. And so it's a big problem not to try to set up a system to deal with that in today's world. So those were the sort of the epic safety fails that I tried to identify. I'm going to go and look in the chat real quickly here and see if we have any particular questions. It looks like we've got the information in there on the Recovery and Workplace Safety Program, which is great. Like I said, I think all of these are situations, they're simple. I mean, when you look at them, it seems simple to look back with 20/20 hindsight and say, this employer should have done this, that, or the other thing. But, you know, for these employers, you know, they looked at it like it was a once in a lifetime aberration. And I think what we have to try to do is just change the culture of how we view these things. It's not a once in a lifetime aberration. All of these things were things that somebody could have expected and should have expected, and something that we could have prevented and probably prevented in not a very costly way. So you can't prevent every injury that's going to happen in your workplace, and you'd like to try to, and we should all aspire to that, but you can't prevent every single one, because there are going to be employees who don't pay attention. And even when we've got rules and supervisors and all of this, the supervisors that are trained and competent people and safeguards, even when we have all that in place, there can still be an injury. But let's avoid the ones that we can. Let's avoid the ones where clearly we could have done something to prevent it. And with that, Angie, I don't know if there are any questions, or if you have any questions in particular.
Thank you very much for that great presentation. We appreciate it. And that's a lot of, I learned a lot and great things to be aware of. Someone mentioned in the chat, will this presentation be available on our website for you to share? And the answer to that is yes, we have recorded that. And Jeffrey, would you be okay too with us putting your slide presentation on our website as well? Thank you very, very much. We appreciate that. So all of that will be available on our website for you guys to share with your employees, as well as your other management and safety teams. We appreciate it. So I think I don't have just a whole lot of information to share. We are excited, and we'll have a lot more information to share moving forward for fiscal year 23 for Safety Council, because we are moving back into our normal in-person meeting as far as our monthly meetings, as well as back at our rebates and all that good stuff. So lots of information to come. So be sure to check your emails that you get from us. And we want to be sure that you guys stay in the know and communication as well for that. I think that is all that we have right now. Will, do you have anything else? Anybody else? Any other questions?
Covered it all. Thanks, Jeff. That was a good presentation too.
Very good presentation. We appreciate it. Well, if everyone is good to go and no questions, then we'll go ahead and wrap this up for today. Again, thank you for joining us for our February Council meeting. Jeffrey, thank you so much for spending time this morning with us, and we appreciate all that you do. And I will see you all next month. Thanks, and have a great weekend.